This is a single grape. It may not look like much, but this tiny fruit contains everything required to create wine, including the very microorganism used to carry out fermentation. Hello, enophiles. Today we're discussing the incredible anatomy of the humble grape, from the skin to the seeds, breaking down the constituent parts and connecting them to their impact in wine. So grab your favorite beverage and cheers the like button. Walking through a vineyard in late August, you're likely to see clusters of plump, bright, mouth-watering grapes. Each berry is attached to the cluster via a stem, which contains tannins that may or may not be desired in the style of wine being made. This choice will determine how these grapes and stems are handled at the winery. Reaching out and plucking a berry for closer inspection, your thumb rubs off a bit of a waxy outer layer. This is the bloom, and though not visible, it is teeming with yeast. All on their own, the yeast can transform the pulp just below the skin into wine, but not while that skin is intact. The bare patch exposed by your thumb, where the bloom once was, is the skin. This contains tannins and coloring compounds that are key to red wines and, to a lesser extent, to rosés, but are undesirable in most whites. Whether the skins are desired or not in the winemaking process, a plan needs to be in place for how to handle them. Raising the berry to your mouth and taking a bite, the sweet, juicy, and slightly tart interior bursts through with its tight balance of water, sugar, and acid. Be careful though. Inside are extremely bitter seeds containing more tannins. Looking around while enjoying this tasty treat, you may notice the winemaker doing the same thing as you. With all the modern technology today, this is still the best way to determine when to harvest. Now that you've tasted your way through the basic anatomy of a grape, let's take a closer look at the components, starting with the pulp. If you tasted this berry at a different time, the pulp would not taste the same. When grapes first form, they are exceptionally acidic with little sugar. Over time, sugar accumulates in the grape while the acids drop, eventually achieving proper balance. This steady accumulation of sugar is due almost completely to photosynthesis, which itself is dependent on temperature and sunlight. This means that cooler, cloudier climates result in grapes with less sugar. In this case, since sugar levels continue to increase with temperature and sun, the winemaker could wait longer to harvest, but if it rains, the grapes will swell with water and greatly dilute the sugar, so this may not be a viable option. During fermentation, sugar is converted into alcohol. Wines that have all or almost all of their sugar converted are described as dry. Other than its role as an intoxicant, alcohol is most often the biggest contributing factor to the body of the wine. Body is the perceived weight and viscosity of a wine, similar to the difference in mouthfeel between skim milk and whole milk. Putting all this information together, it becomes clear that cooler, cloudier climates, or simply picking earlier, leads to lighter-bodied wines. If grapes do not have enough sugar, it is possible to add sugar. However, depending on the location of the winery, this practice is highly regulated or not allowed. Grapes with too much sugar face different problems altogether. After a certain point, the very alcohol that yeast creates during fermentation becomes toxic to the yeast. This tolerance varies for different strains of yeast, but generally tops out at 16.5% alcohol. Even if the yeast can convert all the sugar, the heightened alcohol levels may no longer produce a pleasant warming sensation in the wine and instead cause a burning feeling. Wines with this trait are described as hot. This is much more noticeable in wines that aren't big and bold in other ways such as flavor and tannins. The acid in the pulp plays an equally important role. And like sugar, balance is critical. It is worth reiterating that while sugar increases over time, acid decreases. Acid provides wine with a refreshing lift while also acting as a preservative. This makes it one of the key factors in the longevity of a wine. Grapes with insufficient acid, most often from warm environments, can have acid added before fermentation if permitted by law. Grapes with too much acid could have some acid removed, but if they have too much acid, it is likely that they also have too little sugar and might well be better suited to liquor production than wine production. They might even make a truly great brandy. Acid levels in wine can easily be identified by focusing on the saliva that is released to neutralize it. More saliva correlates with more acid. Not all acids are created equal. So it is worth discussing tartaric and malic acids. Tartaric acid is the main acid in grapes and has the biggest impact on the finished wine. During fermentation, some of the tartaric acid will precipitate. Some of it may precipitate after bottling. It is not generally noticed with red wines, as it is expected that they form sediment over time. In white wine, however, these can look like tiny shards of glass attached to the cork and or resting at the bottom of the bottle. These are called tartrate crystals and are harmless. In fact, if you grind them up with a mortar and pestle, what you are left with is cream of tartar. Many consumers are unaware of this fact, so some producers will add a step of cold stabilization before bottling that will ensure this does not happen. Other producers may choose to skip cold stabilization, believing that any step that removes some of this acid will likely remove something else that lends the wine interesting character. Malic acid is a very sour acid, similar to that of a tart green apple. In most white wines, this acid is left as is. Most white grapes benefit from showcasing the fresh, bright fruit notes rather than manipulating them and showcasing the winemaking process. In almost all reds and some whites, including many Chardonnays, some or all of the malic acid is changed to get a new characteristic. After fermentation is complete, a secondary fermentation can take place called malolactic fermentation. This is handled with a bacteria instead of yeast, and it transforms the tart malic acid into soft lactic acid, the same found in milk. This is where the buttery notes commonly described in Chardonnays come from. Next up is the skin of the grape. It contains phenolic compounds such as tannins and anthocyanins. Tannins are astringent and bitter, which clashes with most light, bright, fruit-forward white wines. This clash leads the vast majority of winemakers to remove the skins from the winemaking process. A few white wines may get a cold soak on the skins before fermentation. This allows some interesting phenolic compounds to be absorbed into the pulp without extracting much of the bitter tannin. Tannins give wine structure and help wine to age over time. When tasting wine, tannins bond with proteins in our saliva, forming molecules too large to cling. Without this layer acting as a lubricant, things feel coarse in our mouths, including running our tongue against the roof of our mouths. This is the same cause and effect when drinking tea that has been steeped for too long. Tannins mature during the life of the grape. We will go into more detail on that when discussing the seeds. The color in red and rosé wines come from anthocyanins found in the skin of red grapes. With the rare exception of tincturier grapes, which have tinted pulp, the pulp of red and white grapes look the same. This means that white wine can be made from red grapes by minimizing skin contact with the pulp. The size of the berry and the thickness of the skin have a big impact on the concentration of color and tannin in the resulting wines. Smaller berries have a larger ratio of skin to pulp compared to larger berries, and therefore more of these compounds are extracted into the resulting wine. Similarly, thicker skinned berries have a larger ratio of skin to pulp than thin-skinned ones, resulting again in increased extraction. This makes it pretty easy to predict the tannin levels of Pinot Noir berries with their large size and thin skin compared to the small-sized and thick-skinned Cabernet Sauvignon berries. The seeds have tannins as well, but also large amounts of bitter oils. The goal is generally to avoid crushing these at all costs during winemaking. Tannins change over time, even in the life of the berries on the vine. They start harsh and green and eventually mature and soften, becoming more enjoyable. This can be seen with the seeds as they will change color from green to brown once this transformation has happened. This is a great indicator that the tannins have matured enough for picking. This adds another layer to the conundrum of when to pick, as winemakers are now balancing rising sugar levels, dropping acid levels, and ripening tannins. In some very warm climates, sugar levels may skyrocket before this physiological ripeness has developed. The stems also contain tannins. This means that for white wines, the goal is generally to reduce stem contact with the pulp. Many red grapes may already have desirable levels of tannins in the skin, but if more is the goal, then including them in the winemaking process could provide that extra amount. Lastly, there is the bloom. The waxy layer on the grape skin includes yeast and bacteria. Some winemakers want more control over fermentation and will inoculate with selected cultured yeasts. This can give a more controlled and consistent output and reduce the chance of fermentation suddenly stopping prematurely, called a stuck fermentation. Some winemakers prefer the range of interesting characteristics that yeast from the skins and in the air of the winery create and will allow these to take their course. We've explored the intricate relationship between the anatomy of a grape, the role of its constituent parts in winemaking, the choices made in the winery, and the effect of all of this when we taste the finished wine. Understanding these elements is essential for appreciating the complexity and diversity of the wines we enjoy. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon so you don't miss a single video. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.